This is Major Robert Kane VC, who was at Arnhem, went in by glider, and what they didn't realise, they were told that there were no enemy around. In fact, there was a Panzer battalion right on the other side of the woods, and he attacked with, well, he was surprised by the Panzers, and even though he was wounded, he managed to knock out several with this thing. Then with a mortar, he managed to get his men across the river safe, for which he was awarded the Victoria Cross. And of course he was Manx from Castletown. And people don't realise that at the time of the First World War, the Isle of Man population was about 40,000, and we lost 1,300, which was more than any other part of the British Isles. So that's what a soldier would have been dressed as. I'll give you a story about the Christmas truce. It was Christmas Day, and the Germans and the British were in their trenches, and the Germans started to sing Heilige Nacht, Holy Night, and so on, Silent Night. The British soldiers heard them and joined in English. And then one of them got out of the trench and went across, met the other side, and they had a game of football. And the following day they just went back to fighting. And the generals didn't like that at all, so this has not happened again. But it's quite a famous thing. This is some of the trench art. People think it's almost all fighting and so on, and people have said that it was 90% boredom and 10% terror. In the quiet times they would use whatever they could get to make something to send home to their sweetheart, or just anything they could from metal and so on. I've got some stuff that my grandfather made. He was a tank driver. You have to watch it with this stuff because a lot of it's still being made in France as they find old stuff that will make it into trench art. But I know that this is genuine because my grandfather made it. This is the Dardanelles campaign. We were very concerned that Turkey was going to join Germany. So basically under the command of Winston Churchill, they had an attack on the Dardanelles, Turkey, which was failed. A very expensive, very horrible campaign. We had people who were lost here. This very interesting picture. Ivor put it up and we thought we knew who it was because there was a name on the back, and it kept falling down. And eventually Ivor looked through his other records and realised that it wasn't the one we thought it was. It was Private William Evan Taylor. So he put it back up again and it hasn't fallen down since. Typical British Army equipment. This is Hugh Cowell Kinraid, who was with his men in a trench, and a hand grenade. The grenade suddenly fell at the feet of his men, who were asleep, and he realised that they were going to be killed. And he had protective metal shield on his what's called a Whitfield steel waistcoat under his uniform, and he basically threw himself on top of the grenade. It went off, and he served his men, spared his men, but then he also got blown off and injured, and that's what his uniform looked like afterwards. And he saved the life of 7 men. And this here, in the trenches, they try and make themselves as comfortable as they possibly can. So they would create a little dugout here, with anything they could get, so you get a little warmth and a bit of peace and quiet and so on. At the end of the war, people were able to put a message on the gravestone of somebody who'd been buried in France or Belgium. And they paid, I think it was something like 6p a letter, and 6p a word. One that always gets me here is Lance Corporal Charles Frederick Bell at Leeuwenhoek in Belgium. Daddy dear, I did not see you, but Mummy has taught me to love you. Canadian soldier. Sorry, another one, yeah. They're not from the Isle of Man, but you just can imagine that this child never saw their father. Here's an example of Barrack Street, Douglas. They all came from Barrack Street. And you'll see quite a few of these in sets of medals. And also the death plaque, memorial plaques, widow's penny are sometimes called, which you got from the king at the end of the war if you'd lost somebody, and also a letter. This is particularly moving. This is the dead of Douglas. Every red dot represents somebody from Douglas who was lost. And if you just look, there are virtually no streets that weren't affected. So it really affected absolutely everybody. The same in Douglas. And you'll find the same in lots of other villages in town. And this is like, you get people to stop here and say, just have a look and just see if you've got a relative here. It's surprising how many people have. And we get people saying, oh gosh, that was my great grandfather or my great uncle. And we get we do a lot of school visits, and Cubs and Scouts and so on. They come in and they go all suddenly very quiet when they see how many people were lost, what their names are. We often find, you know, if your name is Krellin, there are lots of Krellins there. And everybody had gas masks. The children had gas masks with Mickey Mouse ears on. But the thing is, what do you do if you've got a baby? You can't put a gas mask on it. So what you do is you use this. And what you do is you stick the baby in, tie its legs with that at the end, and use that as a thing like a pump on the side there to pump air. And there's a clear view panel there so the baby can see you. We're a double museum, aviation and military. And the reason we're the military as well is because at the beginning of the Second World War, the Isle of Man was asked to form its own artillery regiment, which it did. 129 Battery, which 15th Light Anti-Aircraft Regiment, which became known as the Manx Regiment. We think that they were the only British Army regiment to be in action on the first day of the war and the last.
No problem.
They started off defending Liverpool, and these two shell cases here were fired only a few hours after the war started. and they were fired at an aircraft which was flying down the Mersey, wasn't firing the colours of the day, didn't identify itself, didn't do its undercarriage down, which it should have done, so they opened fire on it, and it was one of ours. But they were commended because they'd done exactly what they were supposed to do. Of course, the aircraft very quickly realised that it had got it wrong and put things right. But these are the two shell cases, so they're a very good example of something that's worth almost nothing because of the metal, but because of when and why and where it was fired. First shots fired by the army in the Second World War. So unique. And here you can see where the Manx regiment went. And they went from Liverpool all the way down fighting in East Africa, North Africa, Battle of El Alamein, up into Italy. Some of them were 129 battery were defending Crete, captured and held in Germany and Poland as prisoners of war. And then they carried on fighting all the way up into Germany and ended up on the 7th of May 1945, right at the end of the war, in the Hamburg area, still fighting. They were anti-aircraft, light anti-aircraft. This is an example of the sort of weapon that they had. This is a Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft gun mounted on a Morris commercial chassis, and the vehicle works. It's been restored. It's quite a rare thing. There are not very many of them around. The gun, of course, is disabled, and it had a crew of 6, and it fired up to 12,000 feet, which is basically 2 miles. And it had a fire rate of 120 a minute, so to a second. And it fired the shell like that. The Manx regiment was formed at the very beginning of the war, and the recruiting, they put out a request for recruits, and people just flooded in. They were just very, very, very good indeed at volunteering. These all show sort of examples of what the regiment was doing at various places. And my favourite one is this. The Germans in the prisoner of war camps did not like the British prisoners of war to have any information from outside, and in particular they did not want them to have radios. But this is a very, very rare survivor of a camp radio, a prison camp radio. And the chap who made it was Manx. Built it, but he couldn't get the cabling for it. So one night he and a colleague broke out of their accommodation and burgled the German commandant's office and nicked the cabling from his intercom. And of course that meant the Germans knew that somebody somewhere had a radio. And what they did was hid it inside a log. And somebody sat on the log, and if it looked as though they were going to find it, they'd have put the log on the fire. But they didn't. And this ended up back with us. It's a rare survivor because at the end of the war, the German guards did not want to get caught by the Russians, so they marched everybody west. So forced marches, which were absolutely terrible. But as a result, basically the prisoners could only have what they could carry. But this chap decided to save the radio, which was marvellous for us. Now, Romsway, of course, from 1943 onwards, was actually Royal Navy, and they built the runways. And the plan of the runways is still here, still in existence. And they mostly flew Barracuda aircraft, like this, dive bombers and torpedo bombers, and dropped them targets off Santon and Port St Mary and various other places. There were other aircraft, but like the Swordfish. So it was very, very busy, and they flew basically 24 hours a day. There was flying here happening all the time. Sometimes people don't realise that the women in the Second World War played very, very important roles. They did all sorts of things, and this is an example of the uniforms and some of the information from some of them. They manned radar stations, they did all sorts of things. It really was, everybody was involved. And children collected scrap and they did all sorts of things. But everybody was involved in it. It was quite a social life the Royal Navy had here, and this is some examples of things that they did. This is the nose of a Canadian Bolingbroke, which basically is a Canadian version of the Blenheim. We had Blenheims here, and this is in the process of being restored. So you can see we're adding bits and pieces to it all the time. It's an expensive job, but I'm using direct arrival is finishing it off.